The flashing lights pierced the darkness as Army Lieutenant General Greg Martin pulled his car to the side of the quiet suburban road. His mind raced, trying to make sense of why he was being stopped. He'd done nothing wrong, at least, nothing he was aware of. As he waited for the officer to approach, Martin's thoughts drifted to the long day he'd had at the Pentagon, the classified briefings, the weighty decisions that came with his role. After 36 years of decorated military service, including multiple combat tours, he never imagined he'd find himself in this position. The tap on his window startled him back to the present moment. Martin lowered the glass, the cool night air rushing in as he turned to face the officer. But before he could even open his mouth to speak, the policeman's demeanor shifted. His hand instinctively moved towards his holster as he barked out a command. "Step out of the vehicle now." Confused but compliant, Martin slowly opened the door and emerged from his car. At 6'4", with broad shoulders honed from years of military training, he cut an imposing figure. But tonight, in civilian clothes, he was just another face in the darkness to the young officer before him. "Keep your hands where I can see them," the cop ordered, his voice tinged with an edge of nervousness that Martin's trained ear picked up on immediately. Something wasn't right here. "Officer, I'm happy to cooperate, but may I ask what seems to be the problem?" Martin inquired calmly, drawing on decades of experience in high-pressure situations. The response came swiftly and unexpectedly. "The problem is you fit the description of a suspect we're looking for. Now turn around and put your hands behind your back." Martin's mind reeled. A suspect. Him. He wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all, but the seriousness in the officer's eyes told him this was no joking matter. As he felt the cold metal of handcuffs click around his wrists, a chill ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the night air. "There must be some mistake," Martin protested, his voice steady despite the growing knot in his stomach. "I'm Lieutenant General Greg Martin of the United States Army. I was just heading home from the Pentagon." The officer scoffed. "Yeah, right. And I'm the president. You can save your story for the station." As Martin was roughly guided towards the patrol car, his thoughts raced. How had a routine traffic stop escalated so quickly? Why wasn't the officer listening to him? And most pressingly, what would happen when they realized the gravity of their error? Across town, in a dimly lit office at the local police precinct, Sergeant Sarah Thompson rubbed her tired eyes and reached for her lukewarm coffee. It had been a long night of paperwork and routine calls, nothing out of the ordinary. That was about to change. Her radio crackled to life. "Dispatch, this is Officer Davis. I got a suspect in custody matching the description from the 211 earlier. Bringing him in now." Thompson sat up straighter, suddenly alert. "Copy that, Davis. Good work. We'll be ready for processing when you arrive." As she began preparing the necessary forms, Thompson had no idea that the next few hours would shake her department to its core and ignite a firestorm of controversy that would reach far beyond their small town. Back in the patrol car, Martin sat in stunned silence, his mind working overtime to process the surreal turn of events. He faced down enemy fire in war zones, navigated the complex world of military politics, and made decisions that affected thousands of lives. But this was entirely new territory. He thought of his family waiting at home, unaware of the drama unfolding. He thought of his colleagues at the Pentagon, who would surely be baffled by his absence in the morning. And he thought of the young officer behind the wheel, so certain in his judgment, so unaware of the storm he was about to unleash. As the car wound its way through the darkened streets, Martin's military training kicked in. Stay calm. Assess the situation. Look for opportunities. He knew that eventually the truth would come to light. But how much damage would be done before then? The precinct loomed ahead, its windows glowing like eyes in the night. Martin took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. He'd faced challenges before, but never quite like this. As the car pulled into the lot, he made a silent vow to himself. He would maintain his dignity, assert his rights, and trust that justice would prevail. Little did he know that this night would become a turning point not just in his own life, but in the ongoing national conversation about race, authority, and the sometimes fragile nature of justice in America. Officer Davis killed the engine and stepped out, circling around to Martin's door. As it swung open, Martin blinked in the harsh fluorescent light of the station. He could see curious faces peering out from inside, no doubt wondering about the latest arrival on this otherwise quiet night. "Let's go," Davis said gruffly, helping Martin to his feet. The general stood tall, his bearing unmistakably military despite the handcuffs and the indignity of his situation. As they approached the entrance, Martin caught sight of his reflection in the glass doors. The face that looked back at him was one of determination, not defeat. Inside, the precinct buzzed with a nervous energy. Word had spread quickly that Davis was bringing in a suspect, and officers gathered to catch a glimpse. Sergeant Thompson stepped forward, clipboard in hand, ready to begin the booking process. But as Martin stepped into the light of the station, a ripple of uncertainty passed through the room. This man didn't look like the petty criminal they were expecting. There was something in his eyes, in the way he carried himself, that gave them pause. Thompson's practiced gaze swept over Martin, taking in every detail. The firm set of his jaw, the ramrod-straight posture, the look of quiet confidence despite his predicament. A nagging doubt began to form in the back of her mind. "Davis," she said quietly, "are you sure about this?" The young officer bristled at the implied criticism. "He fits the description, Sarge. Dark skin, tall, driving a similar vehicle. And he was in the area of the robbery." Martin, hearing this exchange, spoke up. "Officers, I understand you're doing your job, but this is a grave mistake. I am Lieutenant General Greg Martin, and I was driving home from the Pentagon after a late meeting. If you'll allow me to prove my identity, we can clear this up quickly." His words hung in the air, their impact palpable. Thompson's eyes widened as the implications began to sink in. If what this man was saying was true. She turned to Davis, her voice low and urgent. "Uncuff him, now." Davis hesitated, confusion and a hint of fear crossing his face. "But Sarge, the protocol." "Now, Davis," Thompson repeated, her tone brooking no argument. As the handcuffs fell away, Martin rubbed his wrists, relief washing over him. But he knew this was far from over. The night's events had set in motion a chain reaction that would reverberate far beyond this small-town precinct. Thompson stepped forward, her demeanor now a mix of professionalism and growing concern. "Sir, if you are who you say you are, we owe you a profound apology. But we'll need to verify your identity. Can you provide some form of military ID?" Martin nodded, reaching slowly into his pocket to retrieve his wallet. As he handed over his credentials, a hush fell over the room. Officers leaned in, straining to see, as Thompson examined the ID with trembling hands. Her face paled as the truth became undeniable. She looked up at Martin, then at Davis, who seemed to be shrinking before her eyes. The gravity of the situation hit her like a physical blow. "General Martin," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I cannot begin to express." But before she could finish, the precinct doors burst open. A flurry of activity announced the arrival of several high-ranking military officials, their faces etched with concern and barely contained anger. As the newcomers rushed towards Martin, their eyes taking in the scene with growing horror, it became clear that this night was far from over. The true repercussions of this mistaken arrest were only beginning to unfold, promising to spark difficult conversations and potentially far-reaching changes in the days and weeks to come. In that moment, standing in the harsh light of the police station, surrounded by a swirl of confusion, apology, and mounting tension, Lieutenant General Greg Martin knew that his life, and perhaps the lives of many others, would never be quite the same again. The precinct erupted into chaos as the military officials surrounded General Martin. Their crisp uniforms and stern expressions stood in stark contrast to the shell-shocked local officers. At the forefront was Major General Rebecca Chen, her face a mask of controlled fury as she took in the scene. "General Martin, are you all right?" Chen asked, her eyes never leaving his face as she assessed him for any signs of mistreatment. Martin nodded, his composure intact despite the ordeal. "I'm fine, Rebecca. Just a misunderstanding." His tone was measured, but the underlying tension was palpable to everyone in the room. Chen turned to face Sergeant Thompson, who seemed to shrink under her piercing gaze. "I want a full explanation now. How did one of the most decorated officers in the United States Army end up in handcuffs in your precinct?" Thompson swallowed hard, her mind racing to piece together a coherent response. Ma'am, there was a reported robbery in the area, and Officer Davis believed General Martin matched the description of the suspect. We're still trying to understand how this happened. As Thompson spoke, Martin's eyes drifted to Officer Davis, who stood off to the side, his face a mixture of confusion and growing horror as the full weight of his actions began to sink in. Martin felt a pang of sympathy for the young officer, despite everything. He recognized the look of someone whose world was crumbling around them. Meanwhile, word of the incident was spreading like wildfire. Phones buzzed with incoming calls and text messages as news of General Martin's arrest began to leak. Outside, the first news vans were already pulling up, their satellite dishes extending towards the night sky. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Major General Chen was on the phone, her voice low but intense as she spoke rapidly to someone on the other end. Other officers huddled in small groups, their whispered conversations a mix of disbelief and concern about the potential fallout. Amidst the chaos, Martin stood quietly, his mind racing. He thought back to earlier that evening, to the classified briefing he'd attended at the Pentagon. The weight of that information seemed to press down on him now, adding another layer of complexity to an already volatile situation. Just then, the precinct doors swung open again, and a tall, distinguished-looking man in a tailored suit strode in. Martin recognized him immediately. Senator James Howard, chair of the Armed Services Committee. Their eyes met across the room, and Martin saw a flicker of something concern. Calculation? Crossed the senator's face. General Martin? Howard said as he approached, his voice carrying easily over the din of the precinct. I came as soon as I heard. This is an outrage, an absolute outrage. Martin nodded in acknowledgement, acutely aware of the many eyes now watching their interaction. Senator Howard, I appreciate your concern, but I think it's important we approach this situation calmly and... Calmly, Howard interrupted, his voice rising. One of our most respected military leaders was just arrested on the streets like a common criminal. There's nothing calm about this situation, General. As Howard spoke, Martin noticed Officer Davis edging closer, his face a mask of anguish. The young cop seemed to be wrestling with something, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. Suddenly, Davis stepped forward. I'm sorry, he blurted out, his voice cracking. I made a terrible mistake. I didn't. I never meant. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to the distraught officer. Martin felt a surge of empathy, remembering his own early days in the service, the weight of responsibility, the fear of making a catastrophic error. But before he could respond, Senator Howard rounded on Davis. A mistake? You call this a mistake? Do you have any idea of the repercussions of your actions, young man? Martin held up a hand, trying to defuse the situation. Senator, please. Officer Davis was doing his job as he understood it. There are larger issues at play here that we need to address. Howard's eyes narrowed, a calculating look crossing his face. You're right about that, General. This incident raises serious questions about systemic bias in law enforcement, questions that my committee will be very interested in exploring. As the senator spoke, Martin couldn't shake the feeling that Howard was already several moves ahead, seeing political opportunities where Martin saw a human tragedy unfolding. It was a stark reminder of the complex world he navigated daily, where every incident, every word, could have far-reaching consequences. Meanwhile, Sergeant Thompson had pulled Officer Davis aside, speaking to him in low, urgent tones. The young officer's face was ashen, the reality of his situation clearly sinking in. Martin watched the interaction, noting the mix of compassion and sternness in Thompson's demeanor. Just then, Major General Chen approached. Her phone call concluded. General Martin, we need to get you out of here. There's a car waiting to take you to a secure location where we can debrief and plan our next steps. Martin nodded, but hesitated. He looked around the precinct, at the faces of the local officers, some confused, some ashamed, all clearly shaken by the night's events. He thought of the growing media presence outside, of the political machinations already beginning to swirl. Before we go, he said quietly to Chen, I'd like a moment with Officer Davis. Chen's eyebrows rose in surprise, but she nodded her assent. Martin made his way across the room to where Davis stood, still in conversation with Thompson. As he approached, both officers fell silent, Davis's eyes widening in a mix of fear and awe. Officer Davis, Martin began, his voice low but firm. What happened tonight was unacceptable, but I believe it's also symptomatic of deeper issues that we, as a society, need to address. Davis nodded, unable to meet Martin's eyes. Sir, I can't begin to tell you how sorry I am. I never meant to. Martin held up a hand, cutting him off. I know you didn't, but intent doesn't negate impact. What I want to know is this: what are you going to do now? How will you learn from this and ensure it never happens again, not just to someone of my rank, but to any citizen? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Davis looked up, meeting Martin's gaze for the first time. In that moment, something passed between them, a shared understanding of the gravity of the situation and of the potential for growth and change that lay within it. Before Davis could respond, however, the precinct doors burst open once again. This time, there was a group of reporters, the cameras flashing as they pushed their way inside. The room erupted into chaos once more as officers moved to contain the press, voices rising in a cacophony of questions and protests. In the midst of the commotion, Martin felt a hand on his arm. It was Chen, her face grave. "We need to go now," she said urgently. "Things are escalating faster than we anticipated." As Chen began to guide him towards the exit, Martin caught one last glimpse of Officer Davis. The young cop stood rooted to the spot, his face a mixture of remorse and dawning determination. In that fleeting moment, Martin saw a glimmer of hope, a possibility that from this night's turmoil, something positive might yet emerge. But as he was ushered out of the precinct and into the waiting car, Martin knew that the true test lay ahead. The eyes of the nation would soon be upon them all, scrutinizing every action, every word. The incident that began on a quiet suburban street had now snowballed into something much larger, threatening to reignite long-simmering tensions and force difficult conversations at the highest levels of power. As the car pulled away from the curb, disappearing into the night, Martin steeled himself for the challenges to come. He had faced enemy fire, navigated treacherous political waters, and made decisions that affected countless lives. But this would be a battle unlike any he had fought before. A battle not just for his own reputation, but for the very soul of the nation he had sworn to protect. The night was far from over, and the true reckoning had only just begun. As dawn broke over Washington, D.C., the nation awoke to a storm of headlines. Top Army general arrested in racial profiling incident, screamed one. Pentagon in crisis mode after high-ranking officer's detention, declared another. The morning news shows were awash with pundits and experts, all clamoring to weigh in on the unfolding drama. In a secure conference room deep within the Pentagon, General Martin sat at the head of a long table, surrounded by a mix of military brass and civilian advisors. The atmosphere was tense, with hushed conversations punctuated by the occasional heated exchange. "We need to get ahead of this," insisted Colonel James Harper, the Army's head of public affairs. "Issue a statement, control the narrative before it spirals out of control." Martin shook his head, his eyes fixed on the muted TV screens lining the wall, each displaying a different news channel dissecting the previous night's events. "It's already out of our control, James. This isn't just about me or the Army anymore. This has touched a nerve that's been raw for a long time." As if to underscore his point, one of the screens switched to live coverage of a hastily organized protest outside the police precinct where Martin had been held. The crowd was growing by the minute, their chants echoing through the streets. No more profiling. Justice for all. Meanwhile, across town, Officer Michael Davis sat in his small apartment, staring blankly at his own TV. His phone had been ringing nonstop since the story broke, but he couldn't bring himself to answer. Friends, family, fellow officers, all wanting to know how he could have made such a monumental mistake. As he watched the protests unfold on screen, Davis felt a knot form in his stomach. He thought back to his training at the academy, to all the discussions about community policing and racial sensitivity. Had he really internalized any of it, or had he just been going through the motions, never truly examining his own biases? His thoughts were interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Hesitantly, he rose to answer it, finding his partner, Officer Sarah Rodriguez, on the other side. Her face was a mixture of concern and frustration. "Mike, you can't just disappear like this," she said, pushing past him into the apartment. "The captain's been trying to reach you. We need to get your statement Figure out how to handle this. Davis slumped back onto his couch, head in his hands. Handle it. Sarah, I screwed up. Big time. How do you handle something like this? Rodriguez sat beside him, her voice softening. Look, what happened was bad, really bad. But hiding away isn't going to fix anything. We need to face this head on, learn from it, make sure it never happens again. As they talked, the TV continued to blare in the background. A new face appeared on the screen, Senator James Howard, looking grave as he addressed a gaggle of reporters on the steps of the Capitol. What happened to General Martin is not an isolated incident, Howard declared, his voice ringing with righteous indignation. It's symptomatic of a deeper, systemic problem in our law enforcement and in our society as a whole. I am calling for immediate hearings to address this issue at the highest levels. Back at the Pentagon, Martin watched Howard's speech with a growing sense of unease. He respected the senator's passion, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Howard was using this incident to further his own political agenda. General, a voice cut through his thoughts. It was Major General Chen, her face etched with concern. We've got another problem. That classified briefing you attended before the incident, there's chatter that some of the information might have been compromised. Martin felt his blood run cold. The briefing had covered sensitive operations overseas, operations that could be jeopardized if even a hint of the information got out. Had he said something during his arrest? Had his phone been accessed? As Martin grappled with this new complication, across the city, Sergeant Sarah Thompson was facing her own crisis. The precinct was under siege, both literally from the protesters outside and figuratively from the media and political pressure bearing down on them. We need to release the body cam footage, insisted the police chief, his face haggard from a sleepless night. Show that we have nothing to hide. Thompson shook her head. Sir, with all due respect, I'm not sure that's wise. The footage. It doesn't paint us in the best light, and there are privacy concerns to consider. As they debated, neither noticed a junior officer slip away from the group, phone in hand. Minutes later, a tweet appeared from an anonymous account. Body cam footage exists. Why is it being hidden? #Justice for Martin. The tweet spread like wildfire, adding fuel to the already raging inferno of public opinion. Demands for transparency grew louder, with civil rights organizations threatening legal action if the footage wasn't released immediately. As the day wore on, the ripple effects of the incident continued to spread. In newsrooms across the country, journalists dug deeper, uncovering similar cases that had gone unreported or unnoticed. In police academies, instructors hastily revised their training materials, knowing that every aspect of their curriculum would now be under scrutiny. And in living rooms and coffee shops, on social media and around dinner tables, conversations were happening. Difficult, uncomfortable, but necessary conversations about race, power, and justice in America. As night fell once again, General Martin stood at the window of his office, looking out over the city he had sworn to protect. The lights of emergency vehicles flashed in the distance, a reminder of the turmoil still roiling the streets. His phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. The truth will come out. All of it. Be ready. Martin's jaw tightened as he deleted the message. He knew the coming days would test him like never before. The incident that began with a simple traffic stop had snowballed into something far bigger, touching on deep-seated issues that had long simmered beneath the surface of American society. As he turned back to his desk, littered with reports and briefing papers, Martin steeled himself for the battles ahead. He had faced enemy fire on distant battlefields, but this was a war for the very soul of the nation, and it was only just beginning. As the sun rose on the third day since General Martin's arrest, the nation held its collective breath. The story had exploded beyond anyone's wildest expectations, dominating every news cycle and social media feed. Tensions were at a breaking point, with protests spreading to major cities across the country. In Washington, the corridors of power buzzed with frantic activity. Senator Howard had made good on his promise, convening an emergency hearing of the Armed Services Committee. The list of those called to testify read like a who's who of military and law enforcement leadership, with General Martin's name at the top. As Martin prepared for his testimony, secluded in a private room at the Pentagon, he couldn't shake a sense of foreboding. The anonymous text message from the night before weighed heavily on his mind. What truth was about to come out, and who was behind the threat? across town, Officer Davis paced nervously in the small antechamber outside the hearing room. He had been called to testify as well, much to his surprise and dread. His partner, Rodriguez, stood nearby, offering what support she could. "Just tell the truth, Mike," she said softly. "That's all you can do now." Davis nodded, his throat too dry to speak. He knew his career was likely over, but it was the wider implications of his actions that truly haunted him. As he waited, he overheard snippets of conversation from passing staffers, something about leaked documents and international incidents. None of it made sense to him, but the gravity in their voices sent a chill down his spine. Meanwhile, at the precinct, Sergeant Thompson was engaged in a heated argument with the police chief and the city's legal team. The pressure to release the body cam footage had become overwhelming, but Thompson remained adamant. "There's more at stake here than just our reputation," she insisted, her voice strained with fatigue and stress. "If we release that footage without proper context, without addressing the systemic issues it reveals, we're just setting ourselves up for more problems down the line." Just then, her phone buzzed with a news alert. Her face paled as she read it aloud. "Breaking. Anonymous source claims existence of classified information on General Martin's phone at time of arrest. National security implications unclear." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. What had started as a case of racial profiling was rapidly evolving into something far more complex and potentially dangerous. Back at the Capitol, the hearing room was packed to capacity. Journalists jostled for position, their cameras trained on the empty seats at the witness table. In the gallery, a mix of civil rights leaders, military families, and concerned citizens waited with bated breath. Senator Howard gavelled the session to order, his face grave as he addressed the packed room. "We are here today to examine an incident that has shaken our nation to its core," he began. "An incident that raises profound questions about race, justice, and the very institutions we rely on to keep us safe." As Howard spoke, a commotion erupted at the back of the room. Heads turned to see General Martin striding in, flanked by his legal team and military aides. The general's face was a mask of determination as he made his way to the witness table. Just as Martin took his seat, the doors burst open again. This time, it was Officer Davis, looking pale but resolute as he walked to his own place at the table. The two men's eyes met briefly, a world of unspoken words passing between them. Senator Howard cleared his throat, recapturing the room's attention. "General Martin, Officer Davis, thank you for appearing before this committee. Before we begin, I must inform you that new information has come to light that may have bearing on this case. Information that, if true, could have serious implications for national security." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Martin felt his pulse quicken, but he kept his face impassive. Davis looked bewildered, clearly out of his depth in this high-stakes political arena. As Howard prepared to continue, an aide rushed to his side, whispering urgently in his ear. The senator's eyes widened, and he quickly conferred with his colleagues on the panel. The room buzzed with speculation as the impromptu conference dragged on. Finally, Howard turned back to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've just been informed that the police department in question is preparing to release the body cam footage of General Martin's arrest. In light of this development, we will take a brief recess to allow all parties to review this crucial evidence." The room erupted into chaos as journalists rushed to file updates and spectators debated what the footage might reveal. Martin remained seated, his mind racing. He knew what the body cam would show of his arrest, but what about after? Had anything been captured that might compromise national security? As the recess was called, Martin felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find Major General Chen, her face ashen. "Sir," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "we have a situation. That classified intel we were worried about. It's been leaked. It's all over the dark web." Martin's blood ran cold. The personal humiliation of his arrest, the racial implications, even his career, all of it paled in comparison to the potential fallout from this leak. Lives could be at stake, international relations hanging by a thread. As he processed this bombshell, Martin became aware of a commotion near the back of the room. Officer Davis was engaged in an intense conversation with a man Martin didn't recognize. The stranger pressed something into Davis's hand before melting into the crowd. Before Martin could ponder this strange interaction, Senator Howard's voice cut through the din. "We will reconvene in 30 minutes. I urge everyone to remain calm and refrain from speculation until we have all the facts. But as the room slowly emptied, the tension in the air was palpable. Everyone could sense that they were on the brink of something monumental. The truth, whatever it might be, was about to come out, and nothing would ever be the same again. Martin steeled himself, knowing that the next 30 minutes could determine not just his fate, but potentially the fate of the nation. As he watched the seconds tick by on a large clock above the chamber doors, one thought echoed in his mind. The moment of truth had finally arrived. As the 30-minute recess ticked away, the Capitol building hummed with tension. In a secluded corner, General Martin huddled with his team, their hushed voices barely audible above the din of the crowded hallways. The leaked classified information weighed heavily on his mind, but there was something else nagging at him. The strange interaction he'd witnessed between Officer Davis and the unknown man. Across the building, Officer Davis sat alone, turning over the small USB drive in his hands. His mind raced, replaying the whispered words of the stranger. The truth about that night. All of it. Use it wisely. Davis felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. Whatever was on this drive, he knew it could change everything. As the minutes ticked by, tension mounted in the hearing room. Journalists huddled in groups, trading theories and speculations. Civil rights leaders conferred in hushed tones, while military personnel stood rigid, their faces masks of concern. Suddenly, a commotion erupted near the main entrance. Heads turned to see FBI agents pouring into the room, their faces grim with purpose. At their head was a stern-faced woman who made straight for Senator Howard. The room fell silent as the woman leaned in, whispering urgently to the senator. Howard's face paled visibly, his eyes widening in shock. After a moment of stunned silence, he stumbled to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," Howard began, his voice shaky, "I've just been informed of a development that changes everything." He paused, taking a deep breath. It appears that the leaked classified information was not, in fact, from General Martin's phone. We have credible evidence that this was part of a coordinated cyber attack on multiple government agencies. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Martin felt a mix of relief and dread wash over him. He was in the clear, but the implications of this attack were staggering. Howard continued, his voice growing stronger. "Furthermore, we have reason to believe that General Martin's arrest was not a random incident of racial profiling, but a deliberate attempt to discredit him and gain access to sensitive information." The room erupted into chaos. Journalists shouted questions, spectators murmured in disbelief, and Martin sat stunned, trying to process this startling turn of events. Amidst the uproar, Officer Davis stood up abruptly, the USB drive clutched tightly in his fist. "Senator," he called out, his voice cracking with emotion, "I have something you need to see." All eyes turned to Davis as he made his way to the front of the room. With shaking hands, he inserted the drive into a laptop connected to the room's main screen. As the contents loaded, a hush fell over the crowd. What appeared made everyone's jaw drop. It was surveillance footage from multiple angles, showing the events leading up to Martin's arrest. But it wasn't just the arrest that was shocking. It was what happened before. The footage clearly showed a group of men tampering with General Martin's car, then making a call. Moments later, Officer Davis arrived on the scene, as if on cue. As the video played out, Davis's face crumpled in anguish. I had no idea," he stammered. "They told me there was a suspect in the area. I thought I was doing my job, but I was set up. We all were." The revelation sent shockwaves through the room. This wasn't just about racial profiling anymore. It was a conspiracy that reached to the highest levels of power, using law enforcement as unwitting pawns in a dangerous game. General Martin stood up, his military bearing on full display. "Senator," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos, "I think it's clear that we're dealing with something much bigger than we initially thought. This isn't just about me, or Officer Davis, or even racial issues in policing. This is an attack on the very foundations of our democracy." As Martin spoke, the mood in the room shifted. The anger and division that had dominated the proceedings began to give way to a sense of shared purpose. They were no longer adversaries pointing fingers at each other. They were Americans facing a common threat. In the days that followed the shocking revelations at the Senate hearing, Washington, D.C. became the epicenter of a whirlwind investigation. General Martin and Officer Davis found themselves at the heart of it all, working tirelessly alongside FBI agents and cybersecurity experts to unravel the complex web of deceit that had ensnared them. As they dug deeper, a disturbing picture began to emerge. The conspiracy reached far beyond a simple attempt to discredit Martin or access classified information. It was a sophisticated operation aimed at sowing discord and chaos, exploiting racial tensions to undermine public trust in key institutions. The breakthrough came on a rain-soaked night, exactly 1 week after the hearing. Martin and Davis were poring over surveillance footage in a secure FBI facility when Davis noticed something odd. "General, look at this," he said, pointing to a grainy figure in the background of a shot. "Does that man look familiar to you?" Martin leaned in, his eyes narrowing as he studied the image. Suddenly, his face paled. "That's impossible," he whispered. But as they enhanced the image, there was no denying it. The man orchestrating the tampering of Martin's car was none other than Senator James Howard himself. The revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation team. Howard, the very man who had positioned himself as a champion of justice and reform, was the mastermind behind it all. Armed with this new information, the team sprang into action. Warrants were issued, raids conducted, and a mountain of evidence collected. Howard's extensive network of conspirators was exposed, revealing a plot that spanned continents and involved foreign actors seeking to destabilize the United States. As dawn broke on the day of reckoning, Martin and Davis stood side by side outside the Capitol, watching as Howard was led away in handcuffs. The senator's face was a mask of defiance, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. Addressing the swarm of reporters, Martin spoke with measured calm. "Today, we've witnessed the power of truth and justice prevailing over those who would seek to divide us. This conspiracy sought to exploit our differences, but in uncovering it, we've shown the strength of our unity." Davis nodded in agreement, adding, "What started as a moment of injustice has led us to uncover a threat to our very democracy. It's a reminder that we must always remain vigilant, questioning not just our own biases but the motives of those in power." As the crowd of journalists clamored for more details, a hush fell over the gathering. President Eleanor Mitchell approached the podium, her face grave but determined. "My fellow Americans," she began, "today we have rooted out a cancer that threatened the very foundations of our nation. But our work is far from over. The wounds inflicted by this conspiracy run deep, and healing them will require effort from every one of us." The president turned to Martin and Davis, gesturing for them to join her. "These two men, wrought together by an act of injustice, have shown us the way forward. Their courage and commitment to truth have saved us from a threat we didn't even know existed." As Martin and Davis stepped up to the podium, a wave of applause washed over the crowd. It was a powerful moment of unity, a stark contrast to the division that had gripped the nation just days before. But even as they basked in the glow of victory, Martin couldn't shake a nagging feeling. Something about this resolution felt too neat, too convenient. His years of military experience had taught him that rarely were such complex operations the work of a single mastermind. As if reading his thoughts, Davis leaned in and whispered, "It's not over, is it, sir?" Martin gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. "No, son, I don't think it is. Howard may be the face of this conspiracy, but I suspect we've only scratched the surface." Just then, Martin's phone buzzed with a message. His blood ran cold as he read the text from an unknown number. "Well played, General. But remember, in this game, there's always another level. See you soon." As the crowd continued to cheer and reporters jostled for interviews, Martin and Davis exchanged a knowing look. They had won a significant battle, but the war was far from over. The true puppet masters were still out there, watching and waiting. The conspiracy they had uncovered was like a Hydra, cut off one head, and two more would grow in its place. But they had something now that they didn't have before: each other's trust, a united front, and the support of a nation awakened to the threats both within and without. As they faced the sea of cameras and microphones, both men silently vowed to see this through to the very end, no matter the cost. The story of a racist cop and a wrongfully arrested general had transformed into something far greater, a fight for the soul of America itself. And as the sun set on this tumultuous chapter, casting long shadows across the Capitol steps, one thing was certain: the greatest challenges and the most shocking revelations were yet to come. As the dust settled on the initial revelations, General Martin and Officer Davis found themselves at the center of a whirlwind of change. The exposure of Senator Howard's conspiracy had sent shockwaves through the nation, prompting a wave of reforms and soul-searching across all levels of government and law enforcement. In the months that followed, Martin and Davis became unlikely partners, traveling the country to share their story and advocate for meaningful change. Their unique perspectives, a high-ranking military officer and a street-level cop, provided a powerful combination that resonated with audiences from all walks of life. At a packed community center in Chicago, Davis stood before a mixed crowd of citizens and police officers, his voice filled with emotion. "I joined the force to protect and serve," he said. "But I realized that to truly do that, we need to confront our own biases and the systemic issues that have eroded trust between law enforcement and the communities we serve." Martin nodded in agreement, adding, "What happened to me was not just about one officer's mistake. It was a symptom of deeper problems that we all have a responsibility to address. But it's also shown us the power of unity in the face of those who would divide us." Their message of accountability, reform, and reconciliation began to take root. Police departments across the country implemented new training programs focused on implicit bias and community relations. Civilian oversight boards were strengthened, and transparency became the new watchword in law enforcement agencies nationwide. But even as progress was being made, Martin and Davis remained vigilant. The mysterious text message Martin had received on the day of Howard's arrest was a constant reminder that their work was far from over. Working closely with a select team of FBI agents and cybersecurity experts, they continued to pull at the threads of the larger conspiracy. Slowly but surely, a picture began to emerge of a vast network of influence that extended far beyond America's borders. Late one night, as they pored over documents in a secure facility, Davis let out a low whistle. "General, you need to see this," he said, pushing a file across the table. Martin's eyes widened as he scanned the contents. The file contained evidence linking several multinational corporations to the funding of Howard's operation. These companies, it seemed, had a vested interest in keeping America divided and distracted. "It's not just about power," Martin mused. "It's about money. Lots of it." As they dug deeper, they uncovered a trail of dark money flowing through shell companies and offshore accounts, all designed to manipulate public opinion and policy. The conspiracy, it turned out, was not just an attack on American democracy. It was a calculated business strategy aimed at maintaining the status quo at any cost. Armed with this new information, Martin and Davis took their findings to President Mitchell. In a tense Oval Office meeting, they laid out the evidence, painting a picture of corporate interests actively working to undermine democratic institutions. The president listened intently, her face growing grave. "This goes beyond partisan politics," she said finally. "This is about the very nature of our democracy. We need to act, but we need to be smart about it. If we move too quickly, we risk tipping our hand." Over the next few weeks, a plan was carefully crafted. Working with trusted allies in Congress, law enforcement, and the intelligence community, they began to quietly build a case against the corporate interests behind the conspiracy. Meanwhile, Martin and Davis continued their public campaign, using their platform to educate the public about the importance of civic engagement and critical thinking. They emphasized the need for citizens to look beyond sensational headlines and divisive rhetoric, to seek out diverse sources of information and engage in respectful dialogue across ideological lines. Their efforts began to bear fruit. Grassroots movements sprang up across the country, with citizens demanding greater corporate accountability and transparency in political funding. Investigative journalists, emboldened by the changing climate, began to dig deeper into the connections between big business and political influence. As the net began to close around the true architects of the conspiracy, Martin received another cryptic text. "You're getting warmer, General. But are you prepared for the heat?" The message only steeled their resolve. Martin and Davis redoubled their efforts, knowing that they were on the right track, but also that the stakes were higher than ever. The breakthrough came almost a year to the day after Martin's wrongful arrest. In a coordinated series of raids across multiple countries, law enforcement agencies moved against the key players in the corporate conspiracy. CEOs were led away in handcuffs, servers were seized, and a mountain of incriminating evidence was secured. As the news broke, Martin and Davis watched from the Pentagon's Situation Room, surrounded by military and intelligence officials. The room erupted in applause as the success of the operation became clear, but Martin and Davis exchanged a quiet, knowing look. They had won a significant victory, but both men knew that the fight for justice and equality was far from over. In the days that followed, as the full scope of the conspiracy was revealed to the public, the nation grappled with the implications. The revelations sparked a renewed debate about the role of money in politics, the power of corporate interests, and the fragility of democratic institutions. At a press conference on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, Martin addressed the nation. "What we've uncovered is not just a crime against our country, but a crime against the very idea of democracy," he said. "But in exposing this conspiracy, we've also revealed the strength and resilience of our nation when we stand united." Davis stepped up to the microphone next. "A year ago, I made a mistake that could have torn this country apart," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Instead, it became the catalyst for change. It showed us that when we confront our flaws honestly and work together, there's nothing we can't overcome." As they concluded their remarks, a spontaneous chant arose from the crowd. "United we stand, united we stand." The chant spread, growing louder and more passionate, a powerful testament to the journey the nation had undergone. In the aftermath of the corporate raids, a series of reforms were passed aimed at limiting the influence of money in politics and increasing transparency in corporate political activities. While challenges remained, there was a palpable sense that a corner had been turned. For Martin and Davis, the experience had been transformative. What began as a moment of injustice had become a movement for change, forging an unlikely partnership and friendship that neither man could have imagined. As they stood together, watching the sun set over the National Mall, Davis turned to Martin. "So, what's next, General?" Martin smiled, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "We keep moving forward, son. There's still work to be done, bridges to be built, wounds to be healed. But for the first time in a long time, I'm hopeful about the future." Davis nodded, feeling the weight of their journey and the promise of what lay ahead. "Together?" he asked. "Together," Martin confirmed, extending his hand. As they shook hands, both men knew that while their story had reached a significant milestone, it was far from over. The fight for justice, equality, and the soul of the nation would continue. But they faced the future with renewed purpose, strengthened by the bonds they had forged and the lessons they had learned. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. As darkness fell, the lights of the city began to twinkle, a reminder of the countless lives touched by their story. Martin and Davis turned and walked away from the memorial, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, united in their commitment to a more just and equitable America.